defines a generation. Music is a soundtrack of revolution. Music is a soundtrack of movement. Music is a soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There is some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC, a boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Luxury, chitty ching ching, could buy anything, cop that. Collard greens.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I am so happy that you guys have decided to join us again and go on this journey, on this ride with us, man. You guys are having a ball. I can see it on the Twitter when you guys are tweeting me. I can see it when I'm getting the DMs from you and all the messages I'm getting. And you guys are even finding my email address. I don't even know how that's even possible, but I'm so glad that you guys are emailing me and wanting more information about the show and about the topics that are leading up. As you know, as always, I want a two-way conversation. I don't want it to be one-sided. I want this to be an engaged conversation. So throughout this show, please feel free to tweet me at IAMMIKEMUSE, M-U-S as in Sam E, as well as the Sirius XM Insight channel at SXM Insight to get more engaged in conversation. So listen, let's just go for it. Let's just do a deep dive immediately. I don't want to waste any time. I am hanging on to the seat as much as I can because I'm so excited. I've always wanted to do this conversation. The moment that I had the opportunity to have my show, there's been one issue that I've always been bothered by within the political space and in the pop cultural realm. Is a discrepancy in the difference between the use of weed. I'm having trouble reconciling this notion as we begin to legalize medicinal marijuana versus some states legalizing it recreationally. But in the backdrop of it all, you see majority nothing but black and brown men locked up in prison and still getting arrested at disproportionate rates from their white counterparts, being put in prison while we're able to see white individuals using it, but also too being able to profit off of it. We've seen nothing but these new entrepreneurial endeavors that has been able to take place in different states that have made it recreational and been able to participate in economic wealth improvement and improving their personal position and also too impacting their families and impacting their communities with this new economic increase of their income that they have. And black and browns have been able to participate in that dynamic in that space. And so I've always just been wrestling with that. And I was like, I've got to find a way to talk about it from, a unique perspective. The Mike Muse Show, we always come from it from a different lens, and boy, do I have it from a different lens. And I have three dynamic individuals who represent three unique positions and places and spaces in regard to the entire ecosystem of marijuana. But listen, let me tell you, first up, I have a very interesting guest, and she really was, when you think about the muse that really made me say, okay, go, Mike, start this episode immediately, because I've been trying to figure out the timing and when I was going to do it. But I went to a group dinner recently last week here in New York City, and at this dinner I met this young lady, and so we just got to talking, and I found out that she was a chef that was trained from Le Cordon Bleu in specialty in pastries. I also came to learn that she interned at the Four Seasons restaurant in Manhattan, and if you haven't been to the Four Seasons in Manhattan, it is nothing but white gloves and pinkies up and lots of high tea. And now she lives in Phoenix, Arizona, where her specialty is in fine dining within Phoenix, Arizona. But get this, she has since become one of the most sought after pastry chefs in the marijuana business. That's right, folks. We were talking and she was like, yeah, Mike, I'm currently working on ice cream infused marijuana and sorbets and lattes and croissants and creme brulee. And it was at the creme brulee moment I was like, wait, what? I was like, okay, I got to do this episode ASAP, and you are going to be my guest. I was just so fascinated in the sense of the use of food when it comes to marijuana. And she goes by the name of Heather Bohannon. What's happened, Heather?
Hi, guys.
Yo, did I get everything right?
Yeah, so far it's been a journey for sure.
I mean, you are one fancy young lady.
I try.
How does one go from Le Cordon Bleu, trained pastry chef, to literally doing creme brulee infused weed? Tell me about that.
Kind of my life. It's weird curveballs have been thrown my way throughout my life, which has been I've been so lucky with it. So it's been cool to both take pastry, which I love so much. I love desserts. Ultimately, that's my thing. Period. And now I've got the curveball of throwing cannabis in it, and it's been a little bit of a curveball, for a better word, but it's been fun. It's been totally great to make desserts that I truly, truly, truly love, and now add cannabis to actually help people. So it's been cool. I've having so much fun with it.
Heather, just one day, are you just in your kitchen at home, like whipping up like some brownies, and you're like, I wonder how it would work if I put some cannabis in this?
Actually, it didn't start like that at all. It actually started with I made somebody a birthday cake, and I YouTubed how to make it cooler, and then I worked at a financial job of all things, and it turned into, why am I doing financials? I don't belong in front of a computer. I belong doing like artistic things and having fun with it. And then a friend of mine, a very, very good friend of mine who had some connections, and she said, hey, I have a buddy he owns a dispensary and he wants to make it better. He wants to, we're already, cookies and brownies have been a thing since the 70s. I mean, so now how can we make it better? Mm-hmm. So I'm working on it. I'm making it better.
Well, seriously, I mean, you literally made it sound so normal. And I think that was what's so interesting about when you think about like cannabis and weed. I never know which word to use as proper that I should be saying. So you're going to hear me, ladies and gentlemen, just interchanging the word left and right. And so we always just think about weed just from as like just smoking a joint or smoking a blunt. And the most that we've ever heard of it was maybe the newness was the brownies. But now I'm seeing this craze now with gummy bears and gummy worms. And now I'm seeing it infused in chips and salsas, and then the creme brulee. Like, when did it go to there, Heather, when we started seeing that perspective? And then as a result of it, of these day-to-day pastries and day-to-day things that we eat, do you begin to see a normalization on the narrative of weed?
I mean, weed is what weed is. The people who need it, it's great for them. But people don't want to inhale smoke. They don't want that sort of thing. So how can they bring it to somebody else? So if you're bringing it into a cake, it's better for them. I mean, there's the debate with sugar, but I'm working on crackers at the moment. So how can this person benefit from this the way they need to? Maybe smoke's not the best for them. So that's when you start getting cannabis in an oil form, and I can bake with that. And in that case, it's just an ingredient. It's just an added ingredient. And how do I work with this ingredient? So
as a chef, are you able to apply what you've learned at Le Cordon Bleu and able to fine tune your recipes, right? To make sure like it's the right equivalent in the ratios, and make sure the fat and the oil and the butter is right amounts, and then the heat temperature.
Absolutely. I mean, what I'm working with mostly is an oil, so fat goes into fat so easy. So it's been a little bit of a learning curve, learning how to incorporate that into something that's strictly like water and sugar or something like that. It goes into cookies and brownies easily, which is probably why they used it in brownies and cookies. But it is a little bit of a learning curve, but it's been a fun learning curve. And like, how can even gluten-free and sugar-free, and how can I incorporate that into like a more healthy aspect? So it's been a learning curve without a doubt, but it's been fun. It's been a different angle than I ever thought I would go, but it's been a fun angle. Yeah.
It's so funny you talk about like vegan and gluten-free when it comes to weed, but I guess when you think about it, those who do smoke weed are always have this notion of it's healthy, it's an herb, it's natural, it's from the ground, and so I can see how that is. I've never smoked weed a day in my life, and I haven't had an edible yet. This is why this conversation is so fascinating. I can't believe I said yet. I know my mother's out there watching. Mom, I don't plan on trying it, but I just had to say that just for the listeners' experience. But listen, the reason why I brought this and I thought this was so important is because there's some numbers associated with that I want to share with you. And California spent $1.8 billion in illegal marijuana sales. And it's expected to grow by 25% annually to, listen to this, listeners, $5.8 billion by 2021. That's just in California. On the trend of that is the edibles. The edibles are far right behind it. In the first quarter of 2014, edibles were sold at the amount of $17 million in the first quarter of 2014. Just guess what it's at now when it hit the third quarter, just by 2016. $53 million by the third quarter of 2016. This is a growing market, folks. California edibles are hugely on the rise. And if you think that is just a privatized and local thing, I mean, you got to think about it. With that amount of money that's happening, the amount of legalized sales that is able to transpire wire and transact. And then you see that type of money in edibles. You have to think some of these big box consumers. Will Nestle get into this mix of it? Will you see Frito-Lay's get into the involvement when it comes to the cannabis of that? And so, Heather, with that being said, do you hear that conversation now starting to loom? And you don't have to give away any trade secrets or any conversation you'd be having, but are you starting to see maybe more larger corporations start to take an interest in this?
I haven't seen it yet, but I almost feel as if it's inevitable. I mean, there's a lot of controversy that's happening in Arizona. And that's what I've had to focus on going to like trade meetings and all of that is what is allowed, what is not allowed, and who's going to buy into the business. Right now, it's a very small business, very family-oriented companies coming in. But you are getting bigger chefs, you're getting bigger names involved, and we'll see what happens. I'm not sure, but we'll see.
Yeah. Heather, I'm curious if you can talk to me about your customer base, right? And because with here, I would love to hear that because just a stat in New York City, 80% of New Yorkers arrested in conjunction with marijuana use are Black and Latinos, despite roughly equal rates among white people and communities of color. So there's this notion that it is being used equal amounts in terms of whites and Blacks, and in some instances being used more by young white men, which was a study that came up from the CDC, but yet Black and brown are being arrested at high rates. And so I'm just curious, in Arizona, your customer base, what is the demographic of that?
The one thing I was involved in is I'm behind the scenes in the kitchen, and I don't like that. I like to know, like if I were to own a bakery, I'd like to know who's buying my food, who wants my food, who's interested. So lately what I've done is I've gone out with our sales team because I can explain to the customer, if you are using this medicinally, what are you looking for? What can I help you bring? So I've gone out with our sales team and seen who's buying. And honestly, I was so surprised. I've gone to different dispensaries, explained our product, talked to people. I want to know what they want. I want to know what I can make. Obviously, it's easy to put it in a cake and a cupcake and whatever, but I want to know what people are looking for. And so I've learned a lot about the sugar-free. But I am more surprised by the older generation. I did not think that I would have a customer base that are in their 50s. I mean, and this is just what I've seen with talking to customers. I physically remember sitting in front of a dispensary talking to people, and I'm talking to people my father's age. Wow. And I was, in this particular dispensary that I'm talking about, I found one male that was probably my age, and I'm 32 years old. Other than that, they were much older. I would have to guess 50s, 60s, and that was the biggest age range that was there. It was cool to see. It was interesting. Yeah.
Now break it down in terms of customer base, in terms of color. And here on the Mike Muse Show, we're very direct, and we do a lot of family talk. So is it a mix of white and Black and brown?
Very much so. Yeah. Very much so. Definitely predominantly men. Mm-hmm. I don't know the reason for it, but predominantly men. Every age range, every color, I mean, I can't say for sure, but it seems like from every background. And I've purposely put myself out there and gone after hours and talked to these people at different dispensaries, at different places, and seeing what people are looking for. I try to really get involved in the community in Arizona, and I go to the Medical Industry Trade Association meetings and see who's out there, see who's interested. And yeah, it has been literally every color, every race, a lot of older generations, which I would have assumed it would have been younger. Anyone 20s, 30s. No, it's been a lot older, a lot of different races. That's so interesting about that. And I'm wondering, is it the older generation in terms of, now let me ask you a question, is that edibles or is that just general use of the medicinal kind of a thing? Generally, I talk edibles because that's what I have to. I mean, we as a company have a grow, but I talk edibles. So I wonder, when it comes to edibles, are older individuals interested in trying edibles, because it's almost even how you present it. There is this, when you get older, you enjoy, going out to dinner. Mm-hmm. Right, you're enjoying having a nice glass of wine, mm-hmm. right? You enjoy having a nice dessert, and literally with your, creations that you make, that is infused with all the things that people of an older palate will enjoy. Absolutely. I'm wondering, does that have to do anything with it? Do you think? I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. And I think it comes from having two sets of parents who, one set of parents are, I don't want to smoke this. I don't want the smoke in my lungs. And then I have another set of parents who just want to be able to sleep at night, and edibles will help with that. So it varies, but I do think edibles are a little more enticing, a little more exciting for the older generation, rather than like, I don't know, that they want to pick up a joint and smoke it, you know?
That makes it look more refined.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Absolutely. And listener, just to give you some numbers in the context of that, the CDC states that young people, 18 to 25-year-old, use weed mostly 29.6%. And between the sexes, Heather is right on it. The men equal about 17.2%, where more likely women are 11.3%, and the non-Hispanic whites are 15.3%, leading the pack. And so those are the numbers by the CDC that we have with that. Heather, I am fascinated by that conversation and by that, what we just exposed in terms of what it is, in terms of the demographic, the older people. So I can't believe grandma and grandpa are out there getting their weed on, man.
I was so surprised.
With that, I mean, I couldn't think of a better person now just to bring into the conversation, just to kind of give another perspective on this conversation, the ecosystem of weed. I know listeners, I should probably be more politically correct and call it cannabis and all the things, but I think we can have family talk and just make the conversation easier. But this young man, I have had the chance to meet him in chance, and over time, I've always had the pleasure of bumping into him, and I've always just been extremely impressed by this young man and the work that he has done, and the work that he's currently doing. I'm a big fan of how this individual always pushes narrative and pushes conversation on social media. I love how he's always speaking his truth and telling his truth. This man goes by no other by the name of Keith White. Keith White is a former assistant district attorney for the Kings County District Attorney's Office. And ladies and gentlemen, that just means Brooklyn stand up here in New York City. He has since then moved on to create his own private practice as a defense attorney, really protecting those who have been marginalized and underprivileged and underserved for so long. That's a big constitution. And he's also now a doctoral candidate at the University of Southern California, exploring ways to improve the lives of the most underserved communities in the world. And so I couldn't think of a better person to really help us navigate that conversation than no other than Mr. Keith White. What's happening, Keith?
What's happening, Mike? Thank you so much for having me.
No problem, man. I hope I got your bio right, man. It was really important if I got everything right with you, man, because you do some amazing work, man.
Well, you know, I'm happy to participate in the work that so many of us are doing. So, you know, this show is important because this conversation is important. So the bio is whatever.
Yeah.
I don't care about the bio. But these stories and these conversations are the most important thing.
So Keith, what is your gut reaction as you heard the conversation take place between Heather and myself when it comes to all the different fancy foods that people can do, and those who love wine may love a good creme brulee, and as we hear this opportunity for great economic wealth to be had, but in the backdrop we see a lot of Black and brown individuals who cannot participate in the system of entrepreneurship. One, because they had the felony charges, you know, on their background, but then two, they're just locked up for some of these simple offenses. So what is just your initial thoughts this conversation so far with Heather?
I mean, my initial thought is that it sounds so sexy, right? Like marijuana and food. It sounds so sexy, right? But the facts of how marijuana is being prosecuted is not sexy. And so even if you look at something like Colorado, the first state to legalize recreational marijuana in 2014, it was progressive. But in 2016, they were still arresting Black people disproportionately more than white people for something that is recreational legal. And so I think that the conversation about marijuana is twofold. On the majority of America, which is white, the conversation is becoming a very cool, trendy, sexy conversation. But in the underbelly of America, the Black conversation on marijuana, the conversation isn't changing. It isn't as sexy, and I think that that's an important thing for us to notice, discuss, and bring out.
I think what's interesting, I was alarmed, Keith, by the dynamic was happening in Colorado as well, in the sense of the amount of money that we just talked about that Colorado is making off of legalized recreational medicinal marijuana, but yet there still is being stopped. Do you think there still is a stigma that's attached to marijuana publicly, that Black and Browns are the majority ones of users and the cause of the problem, and they really don't attach it to white America, right? And white America they see it as more of a lifestyle choice, if you will. Where do you think there is this discrepancy of the two in terms of we're still being pulled over and arrested in Colorado, although it's legal?
Right. So it's not even just a matter of perspective or even a matter of perception. It's a matter of truth. The truth is that, Black Americans are looked at disproportionately different than white Americans who are doing the same thing. Look at the statement from Republican legislator in Kansas, Steve Alford. Right, his statement was that marijuana brings out the worst in Blacks because of their makeup, because of their genetics. Right, this is somebody who is in office. This is one of a member of our House of Representatives. So I think that for him to be bold enough to even make that statement in public, right, indicates that there is some following or some thought behind that. And I think that if we're going to have an honest conversation about perception, about perspective, and about truth, and about how marijuana is being legislated, then we have to have honest conversations about race.
Keith, when you spent your time as a prosecutor in Brooklyn, in Kings County, what was the conversation like amongst your colleagues on the sentiment when it came down to prosecution of low-level offenses within marijuana? And listeners, just as it is now as a policy, recreational use of marijuana in the state of New York is still illegal, but the mayor de Blasio of New York City has said that the New York Police Department will no longer arrest people for they would not begin the policies and practices of arresting people for weed possession. But if you do get caught smoking weed, there could be some other trappings involved. If you have a warrant, if you have other things, they could arrest you. Right. But for now, it was a ticket summons. But Keith, I believe that was before your time, if I'm not mistaken.
So when I was a prosecutor, I left the DA's office in 2003. So I haven't been a prosecutor in 15 years, right? But when I was a prosecutor 15 years ago, marijuana was a joke, right? The idea of prosecuting a marijuana case was a joke. In fact, many of my colleagues who worked in the DA's office as prosecutors smoked marijuana. So they had it delivered, right? These were conversations that we had in the office. And so, I remember, let me just tell you one anecdotal story if you don't mind.
No, feel free, Keith.
I remember I was a young prosecutor. I was prosecuting in the arraignment part, which means that when someone is arrested, they are brought in to the arraignment part to be told what their charges are. And so I'm in the arraignment part, and I let the judge know, and I let this young Black man know. He was maybe about 19 years old, his first arrest. And he was charged with, on my charging document, it said that he was charged with having one small little bag of marijuana, right? And so when I read the charges out to the judge and to this young man and his attorney, he started to have a fit. I mean, he started like cursing. He was saying things that were unintelligible because he was trying to mute himself, and his attorney was trying to get him to be quiet. But he was having a fit. And so the judge remanded him and sent him back inside back into the jail. So the next day I saw his attorney and I said, hey, what was wrong with your client? He was only charged with a bag and it was going to be dismissed and he was going to go home right away. He said he didn't have a bag. He had a pound. Do you get the point? The point is that they stole his marijuana and charged him with a pound, and the police stole his marijuana. And so The point is that it was never something that we ever really took seriously. It was always something that the police used to create a bigger charge for someone else.
Exactly. Keith, since we're talking about stories anecdotally, one that really stood out to me recently, as we all know, listeners, is our former representatives of Congress, who was a speaker, Speaker Boehner, has recently decided to get into the medicinal marijuana business now, really advocating for the use of military vets in order to participate in that. But there's something about that as a congressperson who has been unequivocally against the legalization of marijuana, for all of a sudden now to be able to make a profit by serving on this board to do it, Keith reminds me of that story of Fate Vincent Winslow. I'm sure you're familiar with this case down in Louisiana, where he was a homeless man struggling, just trying to make ends meet. And an undercover police officer approached him to help him, to ask if this young man, if this gentleman, Fate Winslow, could help him buy and purchase marijuana for a $5 profit, to which he's did. And now this gentleman is sitting in Louisiana State Penitentiary now for life without parole, all because of distribution of marijuana, man. It's just staggering in terms of how this is. And so, Keith, that's why I'm really glad that you're here in this conversation to really provide that context, is because we talk about it from this trendy lifestyle perspective of brownies and gummies, but then there's another side of existence of individuals who are being penalized by the criminal justice system just for small amounts in ways that others are able to enjoy recreationally and economically. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Please keep in tuned to Insight Channel 121 as we begin this conversation further, and we'll be right back on the other side.
Do it, baby.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, man. I told you we had a dynamic conversation that's going to be happening, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with Heather and then with Keith, and I'm really enjoying the tweets that I'm receiving from you guys right now. Keep them coming. We're going to be able to engage Heather and Keith on Twitter as well, so you can keep the conversation going with them. But Jessica, man, I just want to welcome you to the show, ladies and gentlemen. I have a fantastic guest to help us round out this conversation and to really make it fascinating and really make it interesting. My goal was to really make it part of the ecosystem of marijuana, right? So we have it from the food perspective, from Heather as a chef and as a pastry chef. We have it from the legal perspective, from a former prosecutor in the New York office in Brooklyn, giving us the legal perspective. And now I think the best way to round it out is policy. Like, how are they thinking about this on Capitol Hill? I left off the conversation with Keith discussing our former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and his entry into the medicinal marijuana business in order to help and protect our vets who are struggling with PTSD and other likes of that. But ladies and gentlemen, I have a fantastic guest. Her name is Jessica Kelly. She is a policy analyst and state affairs manager for criminal justice with the R Street Institute. It's a think tank in D.C. As her portfolio with the R Street, Jessica handles marijuana policy and has previously worked as legislative counsel at the Marijuana Policy Project. Welcome to the Mike Muse Show, Jessica.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. You're doing some really serious work, man, down there in D.C. on the Hill.
Yes, there's a lot to be done.
Yeah. So what is your gut reaction to the conversation that we've had so far with Heather and the conversation that we've had with Keith? And I don't want to leave it just as a broad conversation with you with that, but in the sense of how we began to drill down on the legal aspect of it. And now it's begin to shift as you begin to think about policy, right? Where are we in Capitol Hill as we begin to discuss policy that is more equitable for individuals involved who may be able to participate from the entrepreneurial aspect of it, but also, too, don't want to have their lives ruined for just small amounts of possession on the streets of in our major cities and rural cities of the marijuana?
Absolutely. This current legislative session has seen federally a ton of movement towards a more open and liberal-minded policy when it comes to both medical and adult use marijuana. And I think that that's in part pushback for what's been coming from the Department of Justice. Attorney General Sessions, as we all know, is a very staunch opponent to marijuana in any form. But the federal government presently has a part of the federal budget provisions, amendments. So since December of 2014, the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment has prohibited the Justice Department from spending any funds to interfere with the implementation of state medical marijuana laws. And this amendment has to be renewed each fiscal year in order to remain in effect. And it's been included in a series of spending bills, which will be current up through September 30th of this year. But in addition to that, we've seen bipartisan work from Senators Cory Gardner and Elizabeth Warren, who introduced the States Act that would end the federal government's war on marijuana and would protect states' rights to enact their own marijuana policies. And that's not just for medical marijuana. That would also include the 9 states that have legalized for adults. In addition to that, the Congressional Black Caucus has included ending federal marijuana prohibition in a list of their top 10 must-do policies, and it's insisting a new Democratic Congress enact within 100 days of being seated in early 2019. So the Congressional Black Caucus is first assuming that the midterm elections are going to swing the House democratically, but then they are listing this ending federal prohibition as one of their top things to get done.
There's so many things that I can go with what you just broke down right now when it comes to that. The most important thing, Jessica, that I'm curious about is in discussions on the Hill, is there a discussion, and do you see traction? We've always talked about how can we decriminalize marijuana possessions from a federal perspective. Right now, states have their option to decriminalize it on a state-by-state basis, right? This is when you see the whole separation of federal versus state, and states have control of their own issues and dynamics that they want to control. Is there anything that we're seeing trying to get Congress to push the Justice Department in order to decriminalize it just altogether?
Right, and it is such an interesting play between federal policy and state policy, and it's almost difficult to kind of discuss one without talking about the intricacies of the other. But as far as we're seeing on the federal level, there is quite a bit of movement and discussion about decriminalizing, or descheduling is another word that's often used, which means that Congress would need to remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. So in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention Act, and marijuana was placed in the Schedule 1 category, which means that lawmakers were saying it had no probative medical value. And even then, they were saying, we're just going to place this here as a placeholder. Well, all of these 40 years later, it's still listed as Schedule 1. So the way to most effectively make something happen, the most quick action to take, would be to deschedule marijuana from that list of scheduled drugs.
What I find interesting about that is the whole Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, because in Schedule 2 you have the issue of cocaine and heroin, but yet there is more flexibility when it comes to cocaine and heroin because of the medical molecular structures, if you will, that could be used for medicine. And listeners think like Vicodin, Valium, those highly narcotic kind of drugs and substances, but yet they won't release Schedule 1 into a lower level. As the House begins to, have to deal with this type of issues in the midterm elections and things may sway or not, do you feel, though, Jessica, and I know you don't have the answer for Congress and you don't speak for Congress altogether, but is there a strong push in order to get them to declassify it and the scheduling of it?
I think that this issue is so caught up in partisan politics. It's really a shame when you look at the inability to prescribe medicine that this is creating for doctors. You really see a need for it, and it's caught up in this, I'm conservative and I'm liberal and I stand here, but you have a patient walk into a doctor's office wanting information for chronic illness, and doctors cannot prescribe marijuana. They can generally recommend a patient check out a dispensary, but if a doctor were to write down, you should have, 2 joints every 2 days, then that doctor could be in jeopardy of losing his license to prescribe every other drug that doctors need to prescribe. So you're absolutely right. You're having cocaine and heroin-based prescription drugs being prescribed by doctors in doctors' offices, and yet marijuana, a substance that has never killed anyone. Anyway,
no, I know what you're saying.
I can't think of the organization in Atlanta. Sorry about that.
It's fine. Tweet us later about that, Jessica. Tweet us later and we'll find out the organization of that.
Definitely.
But I think that goes to a larger conversation in terms of how we look at right now, in terms of how the opioid crisis is now a medical issue, right? And it's an epidemic now medically, now that a lot of suburban kids and stuff are suffering now as a result of that. So now we see different classes and races and socioeconomic status being affected by a certain drug. Now it's a medical issue, but when we see in the crack epidemic happening in the 80s and the 90s, it was just a war on drug of your choice, right? and then you're kind of left to your own wits by that. So even just by the scheduling 1 and schedule 2, you begin to see some social and economical discrepancies when it comes to that. Now, Jessica, I know you also deal with the states too as well, and another interest I have, and that kind of goes back to the conversation I was having earlier with Heather, and those who are able to participate in order to get medicinal licenses or able to participate to open up a dispensary. Those individuals, if you do have a criminal background, if you are being charged with a felony for a low-level offense of carrying marijuana, you can no longer get a license to be able to participate in the economic entrepreneurship endeavor of the cannabis industry. In your work that you're doing, do you begin to see some of these state legislators begin to rethink their policies and how they're allowed to have license to those who have been disproportionately affected by these low-level offenses of marijuana?
So in the United States, not so much. But in Canada, we've had statements from Anne McLean, the chair of the Canada's Task Force on Cannabis Legalization, make statements like, there's an awful lot of expertise outside the legal system right now, and you wouldn't want to lose that. And I think she's absolutely right. We have to allow our industry to employ those with prior drug-related offenses. States can promote that kind of employment from the formerly incarcerated or the formerly convicted, all the while bolstering their economies and helping this budding industry, if you will. For example, in Colorado, as of June 2016, over 30,000 occupational licenses were issued for jobs created directly by Colorado's marijuana industry.
So, Jessica, when you are on the Hill and you're talking with individuals and listeners, you know, one of my favorite committees on the Hill is actually the Senate Agriculture Committee. And there's so much to unpack and unwind. I think that is one of the committee that sits on the low that people just aren't paying attention to. Because when you start doing a deep dive into those farmers and those farm subsidies, agriculture, there is a lot to unpack there. I'm just curious, do you see any conversation happening within the Senate Agriculture Committee when it comes to farming, in particular medicinal farmers? In particular, I'm thinking about in the state of Florida right now in terms of who they allow that can actually farm medicinal marijuana, if you will. In particular, the black farmers are happening in Florida.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually helped work on the Senate Bill 8A in the state of Florida specifically, which was the implementation bill for Amendment 2, which passed with a supermajority of the vote in Florida in November of 16. So what we're seeing right now is in the application process in Florida to be able to be licensed to cultivate marijuana, there is an equitable provision in that application system. So if you are a black farmer and you have the requisite experience needed to qualify to grow and cultivate marijuana, then you get additional points on your application. And so the top 7 point scorers, and then beyond that as the patient list grows, are able to get these cultivation licenses and enter the medical marijuana industry in that state.
So, Keith, I want to bring that into you, bring you now into the conversation when it comes to that, just because as I begin to really do a deep dive into this industry, Keith, as you know, I'm a big proponent and advocate of entrepreneurship and exposure, and that's something that really also is not sitting well with me is the fact that a lot of our black and brown brothers and sisters are unable to get licenses for dispensaries. They're unable to get venture capital for funding. They're unable to even register as a result of them having these felonies due to these low-level offenses that they've been had, and for the fact that most of these states have yet to decriminalize these areas. In your work that you do, have you come up against this where you had to really fight for your clients in order to do this, or just in the legal system, are you and your colleagues talking about ways to decriminalize it so that more black and browns can have access to this new economy?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The issue is really about historically how black and brown people have had a relationship to state power, right? And so historically, black and brown people's relationship to state power has been one of abuse. And so we have seen abuse with regard to lack of education, lack of social services, lack of the type of environment that is going to be healthy for their development and growth. So what black and brown people have done, being brilliant people, right? We've become entrepreneurs. We've done things that have been outside of state power so that we could have a sense of freedom, a sense of independence. However, as we see the conversation about marijuana, the legalization of marijuana, whether medicinally or recreationally, scale up, we see that our relationship to abuse by state powers also scaling up. And so someone who is historically disenfranchised says, you know what, I'm going to do something that's going to empower myself, my family, my community that actually doesn't have a negative effect. And so they get into this marijuana business. They catch a case, and now they are barred from doing the thing once it becomes legal. And so what we've seen is we've worked to obviously try to get cases expunged. But New York is a very particular place where that's not happening. And so in other states, that's happening. But New York is behind the 8 ball on that.
Keith, I couldn't agree with you more behind the 8 ball. And other states are actually having an advantage with this, I shouldn't say an advantage, a great model to follow. And Jessica and Heather, I'll be curious your reaction to this as well, is in Oakland, California, where California Representative Barbara Lee has wanted to add the diversity within the marijuana industry by actually allowing those who have had felonies for low-level offenses the ability to be equitable in this space, in order for them to be the first ones in order to get in line for a license, to get in line for dispensaries. There's even incubators now that are happening in Oakland, California for this to happen. And interesting enough, Jessica, Massachusetts has also took a really lead in this scenario when it comes to equitable access to licenses and to policies associated with it. And guys, when we really think about it, Massachusetts has been on the forefront of a lot of things. The model and existence of what we now know to be Obamacare, but which was once Romneycare, if you will, and now also too we're seeing what they're doing in terms of making it equitable with that. So Jessica, I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you see states beginning to make moves in around that conversation of equity and making things equitable? And then Heather, I want you to chime into as well. And as you working with these dispensaries, do you see a diversity aspect within dispensaries? And really talk to us a little bit about your experience in getting licensed and the regulation aspect that come to it. But Jessica, let me hear your thoughts first.
Definitely. I think Massachusetts has developed an arrangement that should become a model for the rest of the country. Specifically, business applicants who are applying for licenses will be eligible for special review if at least 51% of their employees have a prior drug-related conviction. Another thing that Massachusetts has discussed and is kind of stalling on right now is the idea of providing social use clubs or on-site cannabis use locations. And that is really, truly going to help these people who are getting pinged for possession while they're walking down the street. If you're visiting a state like Massachusetts or like Colorado, it's imperative to have somewhere to be in order to enjoy marijuana and not risk arrest.
Yeah. So Heather, we're talking right now about like licensing. We're talking a lot about backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And so you, as a pastry chef, I'm sure one can't just decide to open up a bakery and have it infused with cannabis and marijuana. So what is the step that you had to go through in order to become licensed? What are some of the things that your dispensaries had to go through? And do you notice any diversity in the space or a lack of diversity in the space?
I feel like Arizona is very much a lack of diversity. And I also feel like there's a lot of verbiage in Arizona it's poorly written. We're actually kind of in an uproar in Arizona as we speak right now in differentiating marijuana versus cannabis. And we had a conviction happen with somebody that had the extraction of, and that's the big thing that's going on in the cannabis industry in Arizona is the extraction of versus the flower itself. And the way the law was written is actually kind of very poorly written and kind of the fear in the cannabis industry in Arizona per se. So we're kind of in this weird limbo as we speak in Arizona is how it's classified. Marijuana is legal medically, but the extraction of is in this weird little floating cloud of question. They don't know how to prosecute it. Now, even as myself as a chef in this industry, is the extraction of is this weird question. Mm-hmm. And the way we use it is an extraction of the plant. It's extracted into an oil with CO2 and yada, yada, yada. But is that legal? Is that not legal? And that's going to be the big question of how is it brought up and how is it written? And it's kind of sad that this is the way it's gone, is there's too much gray area right now. And I know that in opening dispensaries, it's almost like a lottery system. How much money do you have? And again, that's sad, because if this is truly helping people, why is it so hard? Why are we having so many issues? Why are we having so many hurdles to jump over? So it's been interesting sitting back and learning about that, and kind of, I mean, I'm a chef. I love to bake. No matter what I use, what ingredients I use, I love to bake. I will always bake. But how this can help people, why not bake with this? But where do the laws fall in that? And we'll see what happens in Arizona.
Was it difficult for you, Heather, to get a license and to be able to use this? Did you have to go through a lot of regulations and hoops?
Yes. A lot of background checks, especially as I am an agent per se. And so you had an extensive background check to even work with it in Arizona. So anyone with any kind of felonies, you're out, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad to some extent. It's interesting to say, but there was a little bit of hurdles in that regards. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Well, Keith, I want to come back to you now, because now we're talking about hurdles when it comes to licensing, and that is a hurdle. So beyond just the notion of people of color being marginalized and being put over at disproportionate rates and have felonies associated for low levels of offenses of marijuana, when whites are actually using it, some instances at higher rates, but not being prosecuted at all, so they can go on to get the licenses. But then once you are clear for the licensing, there is this hurdle of financial scenarios, right? And one could say you don't want to make it cheap in order to get in, because then everyone will have it, so it has to be some regulation, I guess, through economics, preventive barriers, in order as this gets more increased, right? But then within the state of New York, the hurdles are $10,000. And so as we look for entrepreneurship when it comes to people of color, how then do we overcome, one, the issue of having the notion of the felony, but then overcome the obstacle of access to capital, right? And listeners, that access to capital is not just a barrier. It's also a barrier outside the weed industry. So it's just not particular to the weed industry, but for people of color to get access to capital, so entrepreneurship is always a challenge. And so how then do we begin the narrative, Keith? And now I want to move into our solutions in order to help overcome that barrier of access.
Right. So, I mean, I think your point is very well stated. It's not specific to the marijuana industry, right? There is a barrier, there is a wall, absolutely, to Black entrepreneurialism, and access to startup capital and access to bridge loans. And I think that the way forward past that is cooperative economics. We've got to start looking at each other as business partners, as business opportunities. We have to start looking at each other that way, as opposed to just competition. And I think that there is a certain level of competition bred in Black and brown communities where we're not working really cooperatively with one another. And I think that the other issue is, when we talk about the disparity with regard to marijuana industry and entrepreneurialism, it's not just Black and brown. It's also it's awesome to hear Heather's story, and it's awesome to hear Jessica's perspective, obviously. But it's not just Black and brown. It's also women, right? And then if you go even you cut the divide even more, now where are the Black and brown women in this space? And I think that the solution there is really about us starting to build with one another. And I think that if we can take executives, because there is a disparity, that's the thing that Massachusetts has been addressing, right? Is recognizing that there's this counter narrative that there's a growing number of Black and brown executives in the marijuana industry, but they're not owners. And
right.
So we have to start empowering executives to become owners and start training them in the skill sets, because the skill sets that make someone a good executive is different than someone that's a good owner.
Yeah, man, I got to say, and listeners, you hear me say this all the time. I never know where our conversations are going to go every time I begin a show. I never know where I'm going to land on, but I didn't expect to feel the emotions I'm feeling right now. Listening to you, Keith, and Heather and Jessica, in particular, Heather, just listening to you be able to use your gift. You have a gift of pastries, of baking is what you love, but then also, too, I just feel some kind of way in terms of Black and brown men, and as Keith mentioned, Black and brown women in particularly don't have have the ability to have that access that could be a benefit to all the medicinal benefits of cannabis provides in terms of a lot of diseases that affect the Black and brown community at high proportionate rates, hypertension, arthritis, the list goes on. And I'm not advocating that one should begin to use cannabis as a way of healing themselves, but there is something I believe in the freedom of having the option to choose, right, and having it out there. And so if that is where you want to go, that's where you should. And so I'm really even more wrestling with this notion of how and what do we do in order to prevent that from happening. And so thank you, Heather, for bringing that perspective into it and bringing that to realization to me, and Keith bringing that realization of women and Black and brown women. Jessica, I want to go to you in terms of solution two as well. So we heard Keith's solutions of cooperativeness when it comes to economic access and entrepreneurship. What is a solution that we can do? Because I don't want this to be a soapbox moment, and clearly we need to have a part two with the three of you to come back on, and I want to do this in person where you guys are all live, and we want to get this on video. And it's been great. We've been able to promote Barbara Lee and we promote Massachusetts and what's happening in Oakland. And Jessica, what can we do as just listeners and just citizens of the United States of America to really get some of these issues addressed? And we can see that, it may be difficult. I don't want to put any negativity is nothing is impossible to move the federal government, but we're seeing now that states are making movements and progress. We think about Massachusetts and California. What else could we be doing just because of citizens to help amplify this narrative, to one, change the narrative, but then two, eliminate a lot of the barriers that's existing?
Definitely. Number one would be to use your voice. Support for legalization is at the highest point that it's been in 5 decades. It's sitting at 64%. And now the majority of Republicans support legalizing marijuana. We're at 51% of Republicans, and that's up 9 percentage points from 2016. So if you think that we should be using marijuana, if you think that Heather should be baking more delicious goodies, then literally call your local representative. And by local, I mean call your state official. Right now in the United States, 24 states allow the initiative process. So we can use our grassroots and coalition building efforts to come together and say, look, it's time that our state passes a law that will help patients. And you've seen that presently in Utah. Utah right now has a ballot initiative live for the 2018 election that's going to hopefully regulate medical marijuana in that state. And then as far as what people can do even more locally is just talk to one another. Let's remove the stigma and the taboo that surrounds people who use marijuana. It's pretty common in America to go out after work to a happy hour and maybe grab a beer and then come in the next day, but it's much less common to hear people openly talk about going home and having a joint for relaxation. So let's just try to normalize some of this activity.
Well, folks, with that is my time. Keith, please give out your social media handles so that people can follow you and engage with you and ask you more questions and follow up after our conversation today.
So my Instagram is just Keith White, KeithWhite.
Awesome. And Jessica, do you have a Twitter?
I do. I'm at Jess D. Kelly, Jess, the capital letter D, and Kelley.
Awesome. And Heather, do you have a Twitter account by chance?
I do. I am Baked and Battered Confections on Twitter and on Instagram.
That is awesome. This is exactly what I dreamed of and wanted to have this episode. And if anything, this makes me realize that there's so much more work to amplify. There's so much more to go. And so thank you guys for joining the Mike Muse Show. And I hope to have you guys back part 2 real soon.
Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to Mike Muse Show. Hit me up at IAMMIKEMUSE, MU as in Sam E. Thank you.
Don't criticize